expectations, something we'll have to look at in more detail later. So once we add this row term, this then becomes what is sometimes referred to as the modern Phillips curve. Again, notice we have inflation expectations, so we can move from nominal to real interest rates. We have our unemployment gap, so we've also got our benchmark that is going to tell us whether the labor market is tight or loose, and we have our price or supply shock terms. So those are the three factors then that we have in our modern Phillips curve. Now, one of the things that we might ask ourselves is, what happens, back here, what happens to the short-run Phillips curve if the value of omega increases? So notice that the short-run Phillips curve is still downward sloping, and the slope of that Phillips curve, here's the unemployment rate, here's the inflation rate, is given by minus omega. So what happens to the short-term Phillips curve if the value of omega increases? No, curve does not shift. It becomes steeper, right? So now the slope gets steeper as the value of omega goes up. Well, what does a steeper slope signify? Right? Inflation then becomes more sensitive to deviations in the unemployment rate from the natural rate. More sensitive. More sensitive means that wages and prices are now more flexible. So the larger the value of omega, the steeper the Phillips curve, the more flexible wages and prices become. The more sensitive inflation is now to the unemployment gap. Now, what happens if the value of omega just continues to rise? The short-run Phillips curve gets steeper and steeper, until it becomes vertical. And what happens then? The short-run curve is the same as the long-run curve. And we would have complete wage and price flexibility. Now let's think about the opposite. What happens as the value of omega comes down? Well, of course, this means the short-run Phillips curve would get flatter and flatter. So changes in the unemployment gap would have smaller and smaller effect on inflation. Wages and prices would then be stickier, and inflation would be less sensitive to deviations between the actual and natural rate of unemployment. So the value of omega turns out to be very important in terms of how we think about the sensitivity of inflation to the unemployment gap. Now, we've got inflationary expectations in our modern Phillips curve equation. Way back near the beginning of the semester, we talked a little bit about expected inflation, and one of the things that I mentioned at that point was that inflationary expectations are really hard to measure. Yeah, we have a couple of ways of doing it by looking at nominal versus real interest rates in the U.S. Treasury market. We can actually go out and survey people and ask them what it is that you think inflation will be over the next 5 years or something. Neither of those seem to be all that satisfying. So we need some way to make our model tractable and deal with expected inflation. So we're going to use a very simple assumption here, one that we will relax later. We'll look at a couple of alternatives to this particular assumption, but the assumption that we're going to use is that expected inflation is formed in what we call an adaptive way. We basically adapt our expectations to what's already happened in the past. And the specific formulation that we're going to use is that this year's expected inflation, right, pi super E sub t, is equal to last year's actual inflation. So our expectation of inflation this year is simply based on whatever actual inflation was last year. Now, that may sound like a very restrictive assumption, but it turns out many of us, many people, businesses, and policymakers, actually form expectations of lots of different things like that. So as an example, do we have any 49er fans here? Okay. Well, not too many. Okay. So at the beginning of the season, what were our expectations for how the 49ers would do this year? Pretty good, right? Why is that? Gee, they had a really good season last year. Now, think about at the beginning of the season, what was our expectation for the Raiders? Right? Why? The Raiders were really bad last year. Well, they were really bad the 10 years prior to that, too, but they were really bad last year. Now, be honest. At the beginning of the season, what were your expectations for the Cal football team? Remember, they were 1-11 last year. You know, most of us didn't have great expectations. Now, notice, what they've actually done has exceeded probably most of our expectations. Just because we have adaptive expectations or any other formulation of expectations doesn't mean that our expectations are going to be met. But we often make expectations about things that happen in the future based on what has happened in the past. By the way, that's also true for the Giants playing today. Last score I saw was 4-4. But what do we know about the Giants coming into the season? What do we know about them coming into the playoffs just, 10 days ago? The one thing I knew? Torture, right? Because every time the Giants get into the playoffs, what is it? It's torture to watch them. It just, what are you going to do? It's based on history. Okay? That's what adaptive expectations are all about. So that's the formulation that we're going to use. So now we can make that substitution. So right here, we're simply substituting last year's inflation for this year's expected inflation. That's our short-run Phillips curve completely worked out so that we have something that we can deal with and is trackable. Okay. Now, it actually turns out that adaptive expectations make the model much easier to work with. So that's quite advantageous. Now, if it was only easy to deal with, but it didn't actually give us very good results, maybe not so wonderful. But it actually turns out for countries that have relatively low inflation rates, using adaptive expectations actually works quite well. And we'll see over the next couple of sessions that, indeed, using this adaptive expectation approach generates the kind of results that actually show up in the real world for countries like the United States. One other thing, though, that we can do with our adaptive expectations Phillips curve is to take our inflation expectations, last year's inflation, move it over to the left-hand side of the equation, which is nothing more than the change in inflation. And notice here that the change in inflation is simply an inverse function of the unemployment gap. Notice what this tells us. if the actual unemployment rate is below the natural rate of unemployment, this will be a minus sign inside the parentheses. We've got a minus sign here. The change in inflation will be positive. That is, inflation will increase. As long as this is a positive number, inflation will be increasing. So if this stayed at a plus 2%, depending upon the value over here in omega, suppose it's 0.5, then inflation is going to rise by 1% for as long as this stays at a positive 2% unemployment gap. So inflation would go from 3% to 4%, to 5%, to 6%, to 7%. Notice inflation is increasing and prices are accelerating. So this tells us then that if you try to maintain an economy where the unemployment rate stays below the natural rate of unemployment, it's not just that you'll have higher inflation, which is what the simple Phillips curve told us, it's that that inflation will continue to rise. It also says the opposite. If the unemployment rate is very high, this will end up being a positive number inside the parentheses. We've got a minus sign here. Inflation will come down. As long as you have a negative unemployment gap, there will be, a positive unemployment gap. As long as you have a positive unemployment gap, there will be downward pressure on inflation. This is exactly what they're seeing in Europe today. A year ago, inflation in Europe was about 1.5%. Today, inflation in Europe is 0.3%. Europe has a very high positive unemployment gap, unemployment rate of about 12%. Okay? So our formulation of the modern Phillips curve lets us see some other things as well. As you can see, this is something known as the accelerationist Phillips curve. Now, this accelerationist Phillips curve shows one other thing. Suppose that the value, the unemployment gap, goes to 0, which of course means that the actual unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. If that goes to 0, then the change in inflation also goes to 0. So in the long run, inflation should neither be rising nor falling. We should have a stable inflation rate. Notice also, however, we can't tell whether that inflation rate is high or low. All we know is that it's not changing. We need more information in order to determine its level. Because it is no longer changing, the natural rate of unemployment is also referred to as the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or something known as the NAIRU. Okay? Now, I only point this out because NAIRU and the natural rate of unemployment are basically interchangeable terms. For some reason, the media like to talk about the NAIRU, maybe because it's only 5 letters and the natural rate of unemployment is 4 words, right? So they can get more other words into their column inches by using NAIRU. So NAIRU, natural rate of unemployment, interchangeable. That's all you need to really know. Now, it turns out that the Phillips curve is not what we want to work with. Remember, the Phillips curve shows inflation and the unemployment rate, but our aggregate demand curve was inflation and economic output. So we want to make that switch then between the unemployment rate and economic output. And we can do that by taking the long-run Phillips curve and the short-run Phillips curve and making a few adjustments to them. So let's start with the long-run aggregate supply curve. Remember that the long-run Phillips curve says that there is no relationship between inflation and the natural rate of unemployment. But the natural rate of unemployment is the level that's consistent with potential output. Remember back to our production function, labor market analysis? When the labor market is in equilibrium, we're at the natural rate of unemployment. Take that over to our production function, that gives us potential output. So we can simply substitute those two, and then what we have is a long-run aggregate supply curve. The long-run aggregate supply curve is at potential output. Once again, notice changes in the inflation rate moving up and down here just simply move us up along and down the long-run aggregate supply curve. If economic output moves away from the long-run aggregate supply curve, we're not sure where inflation is, right? We're off the curve, so we have to have more information. Now, of course, the reason that the long-run aggregate supply curve is not influenced by inflation, that is why it's vertical, is that changes in inflation do not affect the amount of labor in the economy, right, the labor supply. It doesn't affect the amount of capital or the capital stock. It doesn't affect the amount of total factor productivity in the economy, nor does it affect the natural rate of unemployment. Classical dichotomy, long run. Nominal variables like inflation do not affect real variables like the size of the labor force, the capital stock, total factor productivity, or the natural rate of unemployment. However, if any one of these variables were to change, there would be a shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. Now, we have to talk a little bit more about a change in the natural rate of unemployment. When the natural rate of unemployment changes, it is not a change in the size of the labor force. Let me repeat that. When the natural rate of unemployment changes, it is not a change in the size of the labor force. The natural rate of unemployment essentially tells us the efficiency with which the labor market matches job seekers, individuals looking for work, and job openings by businesses looking for workers. How easy is that to match? That's what we're talking about when we talk about changes in the natural rate of unemployment. So let me give you 2 examples of how it might change. When the internet was commercialized in the late 1990s, one of the things that happened is job boards popped up pretty quickly. Things like Monster.com or Career Builders, or at least the predecessors to all of those. That, of course, had the ability for workers to post their resume and seek jobs, and for businesses to post their job openings. It made it much easier for businesses to find potential new workers and for potential workers to find job openings. So even though the labor force was exactly the same, people could find jobs more quickly. By finding jobs more quickly, there were fewer people unemployed. The natural rate of unemployment went down. One of the reasons we also use NAIRU rather than the natural rate of unemployment is there is nothing natural about the natural rate of unemployment. It's not determined by nature. It can and does change for a whole variety of reasons. So that would give you one example. Let me give you a second example. Let's suppose that for whatever reason we decided we wanted to make unemployment insurance more generous, which might be a bigger weekly payout. It might be more weeks of payout. Well, doing so would reduce the incentive for job search. If you're unemployed, I now have a paycheck already from the government, a transfer payment from the government, so I don't have to be as desperate to find a job, and As long as I know I can continue to collect for some time into the future, my job searching is probably not going to be as intensive as it would be otherwise. We know this to be the case because Europe has much more generous unemployment insurance than the United States does. And we also know that the natural rate of unemployment, adjusting for other factors, is higher in Europe than it is in the United States. Okay? So again, doing so would raise the natural rate. Now notice the labor force could be exactly the same. What we're changing is what proportion of the labor force is actually employed. That's the efficiency with which the labor markets are operating. So let's think, let me come up with a good example here. Okay, we have a big earthquake. Capital stock goes down. Uh-oh, some people got killed. What happens? The long-run aggregate supply curve would shift to the left. With a smaller labor force and a smaller capital stock, potential output will also fall. Now remember, the model that we're building is a short-term model of business fluctuations. So we're not necessarily saying, oh, gee, in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, we won't rebuild the capital stock and therefore get back to the same capital-to-labor ratio we had before. Right? That's exactly what the solo model would tell us. But in the short run, that's not going to happen. So the economy's productive potential in the short run has been reduced. We have less capital to work with. We have a smaller labor force. Maybe we have less total factor productivity if they keep hacking into our bank accounts. I already have 3 new credit cards. Okay. So anyway, this is what can happen. Now, the long-run aggregate supply curve will be important to us, but it is also going to basically serve as a benchmark. Right? It's telling us where potential economic output is. What we're really going to want to know for this business fluctuations analysis is what the short-run aggregate supply curve is. Right? Which brings us back to our short-run Phillips curve. I don't like it when the circle goes round and round. It's never a good sign. Okay. Technical problem here. So, yay. What do you mean, yay? Okay, talk amongst yourselves for a few minutes till I can figure out what's going on here. Now, of course, the downside of that little thing is I lost all my annotation, so all of that's gone. So you'll have to watch the slide cast. Okay, so let's think then about the short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay. As I mentioned, this is going to begin with the short-run Phillips curve. But what the short-run aggregate supply curve shows us is the relationship between inflation and economic output. Again, we need to move from that Phillips curve, inflation and unemployment, to inflation and economic output. So here, we basically need to think about how we can get from our unemployment gap in the Phillips curve analysis to an output gap. Right? So remember that the natural rate of unemployment is basically consistent with potential output. So that's what we're going to need to be able to do. Now, we can do this through a concept known as Okun's law, or sometimes called Okun's rule or Okun's rule of thumb. So what Okun's law does is simply to describe the relationship between the unemployment gap and the output gap. Notice that it is an inverse relationship. We've got a minus sign here. So we can think about what that means. When economic output is above potential, the economy is operating above its potential, this will be a positive. Negative sign means this should be minus. So the unemployment rate should be below the natural rate of unemployment. So when the economy is booming, what we should see is a very low unemployment rate. When the economy is in a recession, we should see a very high unemployment rate. It's that seesaw, teeter-totter trade-off that we're looking at. Beta just tells us what the sensitivity is. How big of a change in the output gap drives how big a change in the unemployment gap. Now, what we can do is start with our modern Phillips curve, our first equation here, take Okun's law, our second equation,